With us tonight is Dr. Meeks. I just thought I would do a quick introduction. She's executive director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, and she brings 4 decades of experience to the work of transforming the dismantling racism work in Atlanta. And the core of her work has been with people who have been marginalized because of economic status, race, gender, or physical ability, as they pursue liberation, justice, and access to resources that can help them lead to health, wellness, and abundant life. So she has a master's degree in social work from Clark Atlanta University and a PhD from Emory University. And with that, I'll pray us in. And after I do the prayer, we'll have Dr. Meeks give us a little background about the book. Then I'll ask some questions. And then what you can do is, as a question comes up to you, get it into the chat so you don't forget it. And we'll get to those in the back half hour of this discussion. So if you would pray with me. Lord of all creation, help us to learn how we can recognize and recover from our addiction to racism and be inspired to seek racial justice by learning from the example of Ida B. Wells and the reflections and teachings of Dr. Meeks and Pastor Stroop. Guide our discussion of this book so we can learn what you would have us learn. Amen. Okay, Dr. Meeks, if you could just give us kind of a background behind the book.
Well, good evening, everybody. And thank you for being interested enough in this to read it and also to spend time now asking me to come and talk about it a little bit. So Nib Stroop and I, as I said in the preface, grew up within, I think I said 40 miles, but it was actually probably less than that, in Arkansas. He was in Helena, Arkansas, and I was in Brinkley, Arkansas, but we never met each other until we met at the Open Door community here in Atlanta, which was a community that provided a soup kitchen and clothing for people who are forced to live without shelter. And they often invited, the Open Door invited different people to come and preach. And Nibs was one of the preachers on one Sunday, and that's when I first met him. He was still the pastor at that time of Oakhurst Presbyterian Church here in the city. And over the course of being back and forth at the Open Door, we came to realize that we both were greatly impacted by Ida B. Wells. And we started this conversation about Ida B. Wells. And as he says in the book, somebody at his church, which was a multiracial church, had told him that he as a white man had no business trying to write a book about Ida B. Wells. And so he took that to heart and decided to ask me if I would be interested in writing with him. And I love Ida B. Wells and had taught her a good bit as a part of my teaching career in Macon, Georgia, where I lived for a good many years. And so I said, well, yeah, I'm really interested in that. But I was really busy. I had just begun to be the executive director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, and it was taking up a lot of time trying to put that all together. So for a couple of years, we went back and forth having these conversations about getting together and writing the book and when we might do it and how we might do it. And finally, after a couple of years, I said, you know, you either need to write this book or you need to quit talking about it. And so I said to Nibs, let's commit to it and let me ask my publisher if they would have any interest in publishing it. I went to Church Publishing, which is a part of the Episcopal Church, and asked them if they would be interested in this topic. They were, and within, I guess a month or two, we had a contract, and then we began to work. And about 7 months later, we had produced this book. And then in the manuscript form, that is. And then, of course, you have to go through all the other stuff. The most important other thing that I can say about that process is that we wanted this book to be something that would enhance the conversation across lines of racial difference and give people a tool that would maybe help them get into the conversation more easily than is often the case. If you just say, we're going to have a conversation on race, you can do that and you can facilitate that, but it could be a little bit easier having a book that is on a person that give, and particularly the way we put the questions in at the end, so that we wanted to try to create a document that could help facilitate those conversations. Part of the reason for that for me is that in all this work that I'm doing with the Center for Racial Healing, I hear so much from people across the country about how to start a conversation on race. How do we do that? Where do we start? How to make it not be so explosive that you lose people in the room. You know, it doesn't do you any good if you can't keep people in the room when you're trying to have a discussion. But it's also doesn't do you any good if you can't tell the truth. You know, so somehow or another, there's got to be this balance of being able to tell the truth in ways that people can access it without having to just flip off the handle and walk out the door. Whether they get up and walk out physically or not is not even the point, because you can walk out psychologically and still sit there and look like you're there and you've been gone for the last 45 minutes. So we wanted to try to create a document that would help to facilitate that process. We also wanted to create a document that would be an example of a Black woman and a white man having a real conversation about race without being apologetic and without having to agree with each other about everything. Because the other thing that trips us up in this effort to do this work is we need thicker skins. And people can't stand to be disagreed with, or if you are passionate or angry, it's like, well, what are we supposed to do with that? Well, you're supposed to sit in a room and act like a grown-up and let people be where they are. It's what you're supposed to do, but it's difficult to do. And so what Nibs and I wanted to mirror was if we could talk together about these serious things that have to do with race, we could disagree with each other, and we could still be friends and still be in fellowship and still be respectful. And that's why we did the little conversation in the back where we talked about some of our disagreements, and we kind of laugh at each other now about it. You know, when I bring up some of these folks that he thought were pretty good and I thought they were pretty horrible, and we just kind of go, yeah, well, I like them he'll say, I like them a little less now. And I'll say, well, I like them a little more after listening to you, but I'm still not there yet. I'm not where you are, you know? So I think we do have to learn how to live in the world. And we wanted this book to contribute to that enterprise of let's learn to be respectful of diversity and difference in people, and understand that on the surface, most of those differences don't go much beyond the surface in terms of the real necessity for us to see the face of God in one another. So we hope this book has contributed to that conversation in positive ways and gotten people to think a little deeper and maybe a little clearer or a little more carefully about where they find themselves in the conversation on race. We both were back in Helena 2019, I guess it was, because there was a riot. Well, it was called a riot. It wasn't a riot. It was actually a massacre in Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, with white people massacring over 200 Black sharecroppers and their families. And people had built a monument, and they did a memorial to those folks who had been murdered. And Nibs and I was one of the speakers, and Nibs went back because it was actually the memorial was being put in Helena, even though the massacre took place in Elaine. But Elaine is sort of really off the beaten path. And if you put a memorial there, not that many people would actually go to see it because of just the location and everything. We were back there together. And I'm still, that was 2 years ago, be 2 years this November. And I still have to get myself to the point of being able to write about that experience, because it was quite, it was a psychic flip that went on in my soul, going back 50 years after having left to that part of Arkansas, and just kind of in some ways looking like I never left. I mean, it was like nothing ever happened. But then 50 years have passed and people are still caught in so much of the old energy systems. And so I was really glad to be there with Nibs, because we were able to talk about that some, and we may actually end up writing something about it, looking at it from through both of our eyes. I don't know. He's a great guy. He's a great guy to have conversations with. He is honest and he has a capacity to hear the truth without thinking it's all about him. So I'm grateful to have had him as a co-author, and would be delighted now to get into your questions and any other things that your questions that you had, Alan, and questions that other people have as well.
I'm going to go right to the victory question, because you mentioned that you collaborated and you had a dialogue at the end, and I love that dialogue. And you kind of had different definitions of victories, and I'm just curious if you could give us a little bit of insight into that conversation and how you were able to kind of get him to make a shift towards, you give quotes in there, I won't give them now, but you kind of, you did sort of influence each other on that victory piece. So love to hear that.
Well, the thing about it is, when Nib said like it was an absolute fact that Ida B. Wells didn't have many victories. And I'm thinking, well, what do you call a victory? She managed to stay alive until she was pretty old. That was a victory in itself, to do the stuff she did and to stand up the way she did for lynching, against lynching, and to speak her mind in the way that she did, and to live and to not to get killed herself. That was victorious as far as I'm concerned, because she was a courageous soul that did not back down. I mean, they burned down her office and she stayed away from the South, but she didn't quit doing what she was called to do. So this woman was fierce in her commitment to justice and holding up the necessity for us to talk about the injustices. So Nibs was thinking about political power. He was actually into the white male definition of victory. So you got these things you can put on the wall. You can make a graph. You can say, these are the 5 things we set out to do, and these are the 3 we achieved. Well, what about you're 16 years old and your parents die within 24 hours of each other, and you take on raising your siblings? What about that for victory? That you managed to, what did you manage to do that and live to be an adult and talk about it? What about white women didn't want you to march in the Women's March, and you just kind of they thought you were going along with it, and then you just step into the march and you're there. That's victory. And no, you can't plot it on a graph and say she started out with these 10 things and this is what she did. But there's so many ways to look at victory. I think victory for me is the capacity to overcome, the capacity to stay the course in spite of all of the conflicts that come to tell you that you're crazy and you need to get off the path. You need to quit this because it's silly. Where do you think this is going to lead? You're going to get yourself killed. I can just hear those voices. And yet to stay on that course, to sue the railroad when you're this little woman who's going off to teach, and to sue them because they threw you off the train when you had a ticket, and to win. And then if it had not been for the lawyers who happened to be Black who didn't support her, she would have probably won the appeal. So for me, that it was a clear-cut case of many victories. Not to say she didn't win many victories, was just like, what book did you read? And so we had a very lively conversation about that, but it was a lovely conversation. And Nibs really had to rethink that, because he was really caught in this way that we assess the world that is way different from how people assess the world when they don't feel entitled to the world at all. When you have to look for other ways to describe yourself, your location in whatever constructs are being talked about. So it was, yeah, it was fun. It was fun. And to be able to be in disagreement and just have a pretty good debate with each other, and then he went
Influence each
back and
other. That's what I like.
he went back and edited his chapter.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah, no, that was great. So,
yeah.
you know, what struck me is I only knew very tiny bits and pieces of what Ida B. Wells. And when I read the book, I went, holy moly, there's a lot here that I had no clue. And so my question is, and I think you and Nibs also were kind of late in learning about Ida B. Wells. So why is she so hidden? Why isn't she more well known to the general public?
Well, you know how we like to pick our celebrities, and the ones that cause us the most trouble, we try to forget that they ever lived. And we tend to love the folks that, we love Dr. King a whole lot better now that he's been dead 50 years than we did when he was here. And so that's part of the reason, because of the kinds of ways she told the truth and the ways that she really was unrelenting in her to call this book Passionate for Justice is what she was. She was a person who, from day one, when she was even a youngster, really her father was a good role model for her in standing up against oppression and white supremacy, even in this era when that was a dangerous thing to be doing, because it wasn't like you could do that and go to the court and have them back you, that if you went to the court, they're liable to send you on out to be lynched. And so she had this capacity to be courageous that really disturbs the status quo, because if you've got that willingness to lay your life down like that, you're incredibly dangerous, because you're not going to be scared out of, you're not going to be talked out of standing for what you stand for. And that's what she did. And so it took them all these years now to give her the Pulitzer for her journalistic work. How about that? I mean, she's been dead for how many years, and all of a sudden you covered her work. Really? No, it was that she wasn't ever going to get that in her lifetime, in the era in which she lived, to get that kind of recognition, because she was standing against the status quo unapologetically, and against lynching, which couldn't be defended anyway.
Right.
And then also just against oppression of Black people in general and women as well. I mean, she was very much a voice for freedom and liberation for women as well.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. What I liked about your book was you took the opportunity to reflect and compare her life and your life. And one particular thing really caught me. It was the actions and risks taken by the 4 white people who stood up for you and other students of African descent after the campus shooting. And I was wondering, what could we learn from this example to help us build stronger interracial relationships? What did they do that was so, building of trust?
Well, I just wrote a blog that I would also refer you to. You go to the Center for Racial Healing, and you can find my blog called A Few Shades Braver. And the blog I wrote last week is called Ally. I'm in search of more than an ally. And so Jennings Davis and his wife Vera and Lucille Todd and Ann King were 4 white people that I encountered when I went to college. I had never had any relationships with white people that were positive. All my relationships were with people who were oppressors in one way or another, and who had whatever we needed, and it was clear they weren't trying to help us get access to the things that we needed. My father was an illiterate sharecropper in Arkansas, who we went through all of the angst of working all year, and then at the end of the whole harvest time, having my father not get any money because he already owed it all from all the stuff he had to share he had to buy his part of the seeds and stuff that were planted for the crop. He's supposed to get half of this crop, but his half is already spent before he gets through with the crop. So at the end of it all, you start back where you were with nothing. So you start over, and it's the same, that same kind of system. So those were the white people that I knew. And these white people were people who were so different and who saw me as an okay person and who did not try to talk me out of being a Black woman. It didn't seem to be concerned about that. They were more concerned about my welfare and our well-being as students. And when Larry was murdered at the Pepperdine University campus, we were protesting and engaged in trying to hold the campus accountable. And the campus, of course, the status quo again, which was looking at us like, who do you people think you are? This is our land and we don't have to listen to you. And Jennings and Vera and Lucille and Ann were saying, you have to respect them. And they stood up with us in ways that caused them to suffer, which I had never seen a white person do before. So the blog is called, I'm Looking for More Than an Ally, because allies are people who can join you when it's convenient. Being an ally is like making a contract with somebody. You make a contract to participate in a march or to go help do a project. And when it's done, you're finished. You might decide to be an ally again, or you might decide it's too much trouble. You don't have to be one. But what I think is required is for people to be fellow pilgrims, for white people and Black and brown people to become fellow pilgrims to one another so that we care about what happens to each other, so that we are committed to one another, and that white people begin to understand that racism has wounded us all. And that whenever you engage in dismantling racism, or when you engage in racial healing work, you're doing it to get your own self out of prison. As Howard Thurman has instructed us, that when we engage in trying to do good for others and be open to the messages that come to us, whether we're giving away our material possessions or parts of ourself, does not matter. What matters is that we are engaged with those that are other from us, different from us, outside of us, in a compassionate way, that we're getting ourselves out of prison. And that understanding gets you out of the box of thinking that you're doing a favor to somebody of color because you're standing against racism. You're doing a favor to yourself by naming this demon that has ruined this planet and everybody on it in some way or another. And so that's way different. That pilgrimage together is way different from being an ally that's come by to be helpful for a minute or two.
When it's convenient. Yeah.
Pardon?
When it's convenient.
When it's convenient, or, well, I've got a summer, let me go protest. And then when the summer is over, you can go back to what you were really doing, or what was really important. But when you are a fellow pilgrim, you don't go back because you are concerned about the welfare of that person. And then you don't want to, when you work to get stuff changed, you are trying to help somebody you care about have access to what you know they need to have. And by standing up for them, you make your own self, your own heart bigger. Your own heart gets bigger as you open it up to people. That to me is the remedy for racism, actually. And it's not one that we're that interested in because it's hard and it's slow. And you don't really get to talk about it on the 6 o'clock news.
Right.
It's a journey together.
Yeah. And so following up on this fellow pilgrim idea, I really loved in chapter 5, you basically say, we look for shortcuts in our religious communities and we practice the nonsense of swapping pulpits and choirs. I love that quote. And I'm just curious, just following up on this fellow pilgrims and how religious communities like ours can sort of stop projecting onto other people and then get into the racial healing and not try to take the shortcut.
The first thing I want to say about that is that there is no prescription God's got the prescription for everybody. And God's only talking to the folks that's supposed to be taking the medicine. So when you see a good program somewhere that somebody's doing, be inspired, but then seek to find out what you need to do, because what you need to do may not be what they're doing. I find that particularly this has been the case during COVID, that there've just been email after email with people wanting me to give them a prescription. Tell me what to do. You're the Center for Racial Healing here, with George Floyd and with all the unrest last summer. It was like, what is it? What do we need to do? Which books to read? Where do I need to go? First you need to do is sit down and collect yourself and listen to what the Spirit has got to talk to you about, so that your energy and your commitment is real and grounded in the depths of your soul. So you're actually doing what you are called to do. And I can't tell you what you're called to do. I can tell you that you are called to act, because everybody who is a person of faith is called to do something. And you have to find out what your something is. Of course, we can talk about examples. We can point you to projects. I mean, you can look at other people's paradigms and all of that. But in the final analysis, you have to see what comes to you and what do you have the energy for. And it's not rocket science, sisters and brothers. It's not rocket science. God is really ready to help us be on the right path with this. So it's a matter of interrogating ourselves and seeing how do I need to allow myself to be pushed beyond what's comfortable? How do I need to allow myself to go forward, given what I've already done, what I already know? Asking these honest questions for yourself and listening for real answers, and not just trying to answer the question quickly so you can get on to the next one, but to really sit with it and listen to it and really see what comes to you. Then when you get up to go do something, you're going out of this space that has been fueled by the Spirit for you, and you'll be able to stick to it. The last thing we need in communities, poor communities, diverse communities, whatever, the last thing we need are people who come without really knowing what they're doing there. You read a book and you get all inspired, and the first thing you want to do is go work with some Black kids in some poor neighborhood. They don't need you. They need you to sit with yourself and see if that's really what you need to do. It could be, but they don't need you until you are absolutely certain that's what you're called to, and that you're not being called to walk down the street and talk to your racist white neighbor, because that might be the best use of your new inspiration than actually going to be with a group of kids in an inner city situation somewhere. And I'm not saying that no white person should ever go work with Black people. Don't hear that. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we need to ask the question, where do I need to go? Here I am, send me, Lord, but let me know where you want me to go, so that I'm not just running off like a time bomb or something. I'm going with some sense of purpose and deep commitment, because the commitment is the part that makes the biggest difference.
Yeah, I got a lot out of Nib's little section about the Samaritan at the well, and his takeaway
Yes.
from that, which is to go and minister to his white brethren, which I thought was very impactful. So I appreciate that answer.
But let me just say, while I think that that's wonderful, but it could be that that's where you're sent. It could be that you're sent to the Navajo land. Right. It could be, it depends on where you are capable of going and what is in your heart and what the desires are that you have, and how much you have been interrogating yourself to really hear what it is that you can do, will do, and are ready to make sacrifices for. Because I said, starting here, that there are no prescriptions. The prescription is to go deep inside yourself and explore what's there, and then come out of that space with some understanding of where do I need to go next and what do I need to do. And there are all kinds of people that are ready to help. There are all kinds of books to read, films to see, pilgrimages to go on. There's all that external stuff out there that you can find to do. But the reason why people stay so dissatisfied with what they're doing, a lot of it is because they never heard clearly what they were supposed to be doing. So they keep on thinking, I'm never doing enough. I'm not doing the right thing. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing and using to the best of your ability and being honest about it, you're doing enough. And if you get off your back about it and let God give you more energy, if God wants you to do more, if you want to do more, you'll get some more energy. But it's not going to do you one bit of good to sit somewhere and lament about this little bit I'm doing is not enough. And then you're just all in a quandary about that. That's not, what we need are people out here doing this work who are passionate and compassionate and clear-headed and able to really be loving and kind. That's what's so needed. And we have so little of that because we're just so in such a mess about, well, I'm doing this, but I feel guilty because it's not enough and I ought to be doing this and well, my God, if you get in that quandary and then you're not doing anything.
Then you're paralyzed. Yeah.
Really. Or you're doing stuff, but you don't feel good about it. And it's not productive and it's not enlivening and nobody catches new glimpses of God from being in your presence because you have left God out. You left God back there on the road somewhere when you jumped out of the car and ran off to do the chore, whatever it is you're trying to do.
So I think this is a good point for people to chip in with questions. If you have a question, go ahead and put something in the chat. Jerry, I recognize that you have a question, so go ahead, Jerry, give your question.
Yeah, unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, by the way, for a very good book, Catherine. It was very enjoyable.
You're welcome.
We're talking about what we can do. I remember a paragraph in your book about talking about having pulpit swaps and choir swaps and Wednesday night dinners and go off to a protest. And then those are all things that we have kicked around here. And I'm wondering, the reason that we've been thinking of things like that is that we want to begin to build relationships with a diverse population and not just relationships with each of us. And we thought this might be a good starting point. And I'd like your comments on that.
Well, I think when those activities are grounded in purpose and don't become the purpose itself, when you are trying, like what you just said, you want to open up some doors, you want to create some possibilities to not be an all white place, well, then reaching out that way makes sense. But when you just once a year, we're going to have Racial Reconciliation Sunday, and we're going to invite the Black folks to come have lunch and bring the choir and have a service. And then you don't do it again till next year when it's Reconciliation Sunday. And nobody's doing anything in between to reach out and say, well, you've come here for a service. Would you see anybody in that whole time that you might want to ask out to lunch? You might want to ask some people to dinner, but you can't just walk out on the street and ask strangers to come to your house for dinner. You could, but there's not much chance we're going to do that. But if you have invited the AME church or the local Baptist church or the Black Presbyterian church or whatever to come, then it feels more natural that you might invite somebody from that group to do something else. And so when there's this sense of purposefulness about those invitations, that people are keen on looking for, how can we open some new doors? It's a completely different thing than doing it, and that's all you plan to do. So much of the time when those things have been done, that's all that was planned.
Okay, so if our intent is good, it's okay. All right.
Well, if you have a clear-headed purpose to use anything, I mean, a book study is the same thing. You can just read a book. You can read book after book after book after book. And what's the point? You have a lot of stuff in your head, but are you reading those books to go deeper with this, to get better prepared, to be more courageous? Or are you just reading because you love to read? And this is interesting. You know, I mean, what is the point of it is the question that I think has to be answered when it comes to this. Otherwise, you just get into having a whole bunch of lovely activities.
Yeah.
You know,
Thank
you become event planners that have a lot of lovely events, but you're not doing any real in-depth work of shifting the energy that needs to be shifted so that our culture can begin to be challenged to understand we're all here on this planet together, and we need to be trying to figure out how to live in peace with one another.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Is there any other questions that people have?
Yeah, here, Lucy and
Don't be bashful.
Charlotte. There,
Hi.
I don't know if you can see the hands, but Lucy has.
Oh, I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, let me get some hands.
Lucy and then Charlotte.
Go
I
ahead.
didn't use the reaction one, but I just put my hand up. So again, this book is beautiful and
Thank you.
really incredibly moving. But one thing jumped off the page, and I'd love to hear a little more about this. You said on page 38, the plague of the 21st century is fear.
Mhm,
And this book was written before COVID,
mhm,
published
Mhm.
before COVID. And I just understand, I mean, I understand that in the context of, Ida B. Wells and her life story and narrative, and it is incredibly moving. And she moved through fear. I mean, it's clear.
mhm.
But I really think it's paralyzing to be
Yeah.
terrified and to be so frightened of the world, but also the paralysis that we experience, or I will speak personally, I experience, and I'm always feeling like I'm going to say the wrong thing, or I'm going to do the wrong thing, and I want to get
Mhm.
grounded, and I'm deeply engaged. So could you talk more about that, just in terms of
Yeah.
the question behind the question is, how do you overcome fear?
Well, I think that one thing white people need to sit with themselves and ask themselves do you think that all non-white people were created by a God that is different from the one that created you? You know, I think that's a starting place. Well, and the answer, if you think that, then you believe in, you're polytheistic, but you think you're not because you go to church and talk about God and Jesus Christ. You got to work on that, because that's going to be quite a bit of confusion in your head. But if you do conclude that there is one God in the universe who has made us all, then what kind of people has that God made? All different kinds of people, with some with less value than others, or what? Is this a Star Wars movie where we don't actually know what species some of the beings are that are walking around? Or do we live in a world where we can look at one another and recognize each other as being a part of the same species? It's called humanity. If you can work on getting to a place of peace with accepting that everybody is a beloved child of God, no matter where they are or who they are, and everybody is made in God's image, and God lives in us all, it helps you to open your mouth without being paralyzed by fear, because you're just talking to another part of yourself. You're just talking to another part of yourself. You're just talking to another version, you look at me and I look at you, and we are connected. We've got eyes and ears and arms and hair, and we have a heartbeat. We are part of each other. We get into this othering to the extent that we make a monster out of the other, and then we don't know what to do with the monster. So part of what we have to do is withdraw those projections of monsterism if we want to overcome some of our fear. We have got to stop being afraid of other human beings who don't look like us, because we have somehow imagined them not being human. And And you're not going to get to deal with the fear till you deal with that issue. And we don't talk about this enough. You know, we say people are afraid, but then afraid of what? And why are we so afraid? You know, and we don't pay enough attention to, you know, when we hear a lot of the stuff that's being said these days is pure trash that needs to be set on fire and burned up. That's the best way to get rid of it, to set it on fire and burn it up, because it's trash. And it's designed to keep us from seeing each other's humanity. But we are people of faith and we know better. And so it's time for us to step up to the plate and say, God, help us. Let's get these scales off of our eyes so we can see better. So Lucy, that's my best answer for dealing with fear. It's, you don't start with, let me go across the tracks and see somebody different and see if what I can do. Now, come to think of it though, as I say that may be something you need to do, because you do need every day. I've had a great conversation with a theologian who talked about this, and just as that came out of my mouth, I remembered it. Every day you can practice pushing yourself a little bit beyond the fear you live in. You know, so she talks about doing things like walking in high grass and not knowing whether there's a snake in it. You know, as you work on your fear, you know, push yourself a little bit further down the road. You know, maybe say hello to somebody in the grocery store who doesn't look like you. You don't have to invite them for coffee. You just have to say hello. Maybe you wouldn't have done that if you weren't trying to practice overcoming fear a little bit. You know, I loved her examples because they were just these simple little things that you wouldn't even think about. But every day she talked about having a discipline of practicing to overcome fear, you know, so that you're building a thicker skin, you're building a muscle. It's like exercise, you know, you're exercising this part of yourself that's gotten very atrophied from the media and the culture and the foolishness that's going on, and that has permeated everything, including the church. And we need to reclaim the body of Christ and say to this fear-mongering, you don't get to be here. You know, you don't get to come inside the door. You know, the cross on the door ought to be the stopping point. You know how in those vampire movies, if you can show the vampire the cross, the vampire will, I mean, I don't know if the vampires even exist, but if you could show the vampire the cross and the vampire runs. Well, the cross on the door ought to tell fear that it's not welcome. And we need to be working on it. I was just talking to somebody today about this. You know, there's some real things in the world to be afraid of. But you don't let it stop you, don't let it paralyze you, you don't let it make you not be a person of integrity, you know. And there are many, many things that we could overcome if we just decide, I'm not going to live that way. And I will not live with my life being paralyzed by things external to me. I will not live that way. I will stand up against it. I will explore it. I will investigate. I will resist it. I will do everything I can do. I may not be able to change it, but I will not let it control my life. Mm-hmm. Externals to me do not get to control me. I have to interrogate myself, and I have to say, how do you want to live? And who do you want to be at the end of the day? So anyway, that's a long answer. That's my biggest problem. You ask me something and I tell you way more than you want to know.
No,
Charlotte.
You're a teacher. You're a teacher. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Charlotte?
The book talks about how at one point after the railroad decision was overturned, Ida B. Wells was sort of in a moment of despair and sort of said, I want to take my people and just fly away. Does she write about that despair in other places, or how she overcame that despair that prompted her to do even greater?
I think not specifically, but she writes about in her book, The Memphis Diary. She's younger then. This is before. maybe close into that same age, or close and around that age when she's talking about that, taking, I think it was after her friends were lynched that she was in such despair for a while. But, you know, she writes in the Memphis Diary about her struggles as a human being, and it's a lovely book to read. I mean, if you've enjoyed reading our book here, you would enjoy reading kind of, it's like going backwards and kind of seeing how she got to be this person. And I loved reading. It's called the Memphis Diary. And I loved reading it because it made her more human, and it helped me to see how our lives were more similar than dissimilar, and our ways of thinking and being in the world, which gave me the courage to write the chapter the way I did, making those comparisons. So, but she doesn't, I don't recall, I mean, she wrote a lot of stuff, so I've not read everything. I've read a lot of it, but so you might find some discussion somewhere that I have missed, but I would recommend the Memphis Diary as a place to get a little better picture of her. Because oftentimes when you meet people and they're sort of larger than life, what you really want to know is, how did you get that way? Because nobody's born like that, you know. You're born as a human being, and you get called to do what you do, and you say yes to it or you don't. The reason why we call her a prophet for our time is because she is somebody who was very human, who did have those moments of angst and despair, and yet she kept saying yes to what she needed to say yes to. And that's why we're still talking about her. And we have to, that's the same call on us, to keep saying yes to whatever the invitations are that are being presented to us. And I've been asking people all during COVID, what is the invitation that COVID has offered you? Both individually and collectively, what is the invitation that COVID's offered? COVID has offered us an invitation to embrace life in a different way. And if we catch on and do it, it'll be good for us. If we don't, we may have to go through worse than COVID. I don't know. You know, I do believe that the whole process of individuation, which is talked about in Jungian psychology, is very connected to suffering, because suffering makes you have to rethink yourself. You know, we change when things get unbearable for us. And as long as we can kind of keep tweaking it and making it work, we'll do it, right? We'll try to make it work until we can't. And then finally, when it just doesn't work anymore, we'll say, okay, I give up. And then God said, well, I'm so sorry it took you so long to get there. You know, you didn't really have to go through all of that, because you got the invitation way back here, but you just kept on being so stubborn until it took you to now to say yes. And all that suffering could have been avoided if you just said yes back there when it first came up. So that's how I feel about COVID, that it's an invitation. It's a lot of other things, but in addition to those other things, it's also a huge invitation for this planet, for us to get a grip on ourselves. And we haven't done a very good job of saying yes yet, you know, and it hasn't left us yet either. And it may not be planning to leave until we say yes a little better. So
Jerry,
I hope that helps, Charlotte.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Good.
Jerry has another question in the chat about the music and the poetry. I was curious about that too. That was a source of courage. He's looking for some examples.
A source of whose courage? Ida B. Wells's, or just in
just,
general?
well, go ahead, Jerry, you give the question.
No, you wrote that you seek out poets and music to give you courage to press on. And I was just wondering some of the poetry or music that particularly helps you.
Yeah. Well, the spirituals, of course. I love the spirituals. I listen to that music. I did not like poetry when I was younger because I couldn't make sense out of it. And I can make sense out of it now. And I have a handful of poets that I come back to over and over. Howard Thurman, who didn't necessarily write poetry, but he writes, his prose is poetic. If you've read him, you know that. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. You could look him up. He's got lovely little books of meditations that would be very, very instructive for you. I'm sure somebody on the screen's read Howard Thurman, right? Somebody, yeah, knows Howard Thurman. So David White, a poet that I have lived with and quoted for over 20 years now. And he says that poetry is a language against which there is no defense. And I really like that, because I do believe that we can talk ourselves out of a whole lot of things, but poetry just cuts through all of that stuff and makes you have to kind of stop and pay attention. And you can try to shift it or fix it or do whatever you want, but it still stands. So, and of course, music opens up space. Bernice Reagan, who did the Sweet Honey and the Rock, you may know that group about Black women who sang beautifully, beautiful a cappella music, and make you think they've got instruments and they're just using all their different bodily ways of making sound. It's just phenomenal to hear them. But Bernice Reagan talks about how the music opens up space. You know, the slaves sang because they couldn't go anywhere. So they sang, and the singing created space for them, opened up their spirit, opened up their hearts, opened up the world in another way for them. And so I think music is so helpful because we do have to keep ourselves uplifted. I mean, this assessing this world of racial oppression in the United States and across the planet, really, because everywhere you go, there's enough of it to make you sick. It can be very tiring and wearying, and it's really important to take care of yourself. You know, so it's important to take care of yourself, and white people need to work really hard to not spend a lot of time feeling guilty about being white. It doesn't do you any good, and it doesn't do anybody else any good. The guilt doesn't do anybody any good unless the guilt moves you to do something that you needed to be doing to make things better. So the best thing to do is say, you know, when I have a PhD, as you heard, there are many people that I have been able to pick up the phone and make a phone call for and say, this is Dr. Catherine Meeks, and it made a difference for them. They could have called and said, just my own sister, I'm Irene Meeks, and she doesn't get the attention that Dr. Catherine Meeks gets. So then why, instead of sitting and lamenting because I have the PhD and she doesn't, why don't I just let my PhD be hers too? Why don't I let my privilege be hers too? Why don't I open doors for her too? You know, you open the door for me because you thought I was the right person to come in the door. Well, let me tell you, here's my brothers and sisters, and they're coming too. And no, it's not a negotiable issue. You said we're welcome, and I'm coming, and I'm bringing them. So that's the way to use privilege, to use it to benefit those who have no privilege. And it helps you not to have to feel guilty about it. I don't spend 1 minute feeling guilty about having my PhD. I spend many minutes thinking, how can I make it better for other people because I have this privilege of being an educated woman? That is a far better use of my time and energy than lamenting or feeling guilty or doing any of that stuff that just ultimately keeps you from doing what you really need to be doing, keeps you from acting. So getting over guilt, getting over fear, and finding some courage. Getting over fear will help you find courage. My Bishop Wright says, there's a deficit of courage right now. And I say, people need to get from underneath the bed. You don't get to hide until it's over. You know, You got to get from underneath the bed and say yes to life that's coming down the road, and get God to help your fear and fledgling of faith to be turned into strength somehow. It's all kind of mysterious. I don't know how it all happens to, but when I think about the slaves who had no reason to believe anything, but they believed, they hoped, they kept going, they kept making the choice to live. If they hadn't, probably none of us would be here, but I know that we African Americans wouldn't be here. They kept having the imagination and the courage to dream and to act out those dreams as if they were really true. And so here I sit as the product of those dreams. If Ida B. Wells hadn't done what she did, it would have been really harder for me to do what I've done. On my wall at the Center for Racial Healing, I have a picture of Ida B. Wells, of Fannie Lou Hamer, of Mary McLeod Bethune, of Sojourner Truth, of Harriet Tubman, and my mother. They're all on my wall. And those women say to me every time I walk in that office, girl, don't you start grumbling. Don't you start grumbling. You take what you have and you stand up to that beast of racism, fear, whatever it is that's trying to get the best of you. So I want to encourage you as we come to a close here to construct your own walls of witnesses, a wall of witnesses. Who are the people that help you to have deeper faith and who've influenced your life and who have helped you to be who you are, helped you to get to this point? Who are they? They can be, you don't have to know them because you don't have to know everybody that helps you, but they could be people that you know personally. I don't know any of those people personally except my mom, actually, so, but putting them on the wall or somewhere where you can see them often, it's good for me because I sit with my back to them and they're looking over me all day long. And they're not having me grumbling at the end of the day about what I could or could not do, because what would any of them have done if they had the resources that I have? Given what they did with what they didn't have, it gives me a clue of what they might have done had they had what I have. Therefore, my job is to see how best can I be a good, faithful carrier of the legacy that they created. So, it shifts everything, and it makes you able to get up in the mornings and keep on doing this stuff without becoming bitter, without becoming glib, without becoming anything except the best human being you can be, which is ultimately what we're all supposed to be after. Trying to be well and trying to be the human beings God put us on the earth to be. That is really the work. And dismantling racism is a piece of that work, but ultimately the work is becoming the best human being we can as we go forward. So y'all are good, lovely folks to have read this book and struggling with it, I'm pretty sure, and trying to figure out how to be those best human beings. And I'm so honored that you would bother to want to talk to me. And I will pass this conversation on to Nibs, who's at the moment busily taking care of his wife, Caroline, who had back surgery last week. So he would appreciate your thoughts and prayers being sent in their direction, I'm pretty sure. So I wish you all a lot of courage.
We thank you so much for being with us.
The last thing I want to say is from David White, talking about being a half a shade braver. So every day we can work on being a half a shade braver. as I was talking earlier about practicing, having a practice that helps you to work on fear. To be a half a shade braver is not, you don't have to go out hunting for Goliath. If you're little David, actually Goliath will find you anyway. You don't really have to go looking for him. But you just get up every day with the determination you're going to climb this mountain just a few steps further today than you did yesterday. So be a half a shade braver, and be good to yourselves. All of you, be good to yourselves, because out of that will grow great possibilities, and we become better examples of God's great love for us.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Dr. Meeks.
You're welcome.
I'll just say that everybody, I'm sure, enjoyed this immensely. I know I did. And so we just thank you for that.
Well, you're so welcome. Thank you for inviting me, and I wish you all the best. And just stay in touch and go to our website, please, and look at our lovely offerings. And if you find anything there that can be helpful to you, please take it and use it. That's why it's all there. And subscribe to our newsletter, also to the blog. I would love to have you subscribe. It comes out twice a month, and you can take parts from it, and anything that you find of value that the Center for Racial Healing has created, you are welcome to it, because we're all in this together, and there's plenty work to go around. I think is the best way I want to put that. So good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night.